Today I want to talk a little bit about co-production and the PARATUS processes that we are part of or we are already embarking on. Today is a historic day because we're starting to be together in Innsbruck and starting the ALP case study workshop. So I would like to share with you a couple of thoughts and reflections from around co-production and what that might mean for PARATUS. So when we work in complex systems, it is always, there's a high expectation on what science can contribute to understanding and navigating these complex systems. And the first assumption is that scientific publications can transform policy and practice. So we do some research, it's really high quality, and it is published, and suddenly the practice will change. There is often an element of extractive research, so people have been asked to contribute to the data that is being assessed, and often the publications in the journals are not accessible to people who have been part of the research. May it be because they find it hard to access the journals because they're scientific journals, or because the language is inaccessible and they feel it's not really addressing any of their real questions. So how can co-production help these challenges? Co-production is really very fundamentally focused on collaboration. It looks at the variety of knowledges that different people and stakeholders bring to one process to really understand the complexity. And therefore, through this process of collaboration, new knowledge is generated. Here's another assumption. Projects are an amazing vehicle for change. And a project like PARATUS has a relatively short-term time frame. So PARATUS is a relatively long project. It's 4 years, but the scope is kind of confined. And 4 years in the sort of the long-term trajectory of resilient development is not necessarily very long. So the question here is then, if we have these short-term timeframes and the limited scope, how can co-production help? So co-production can contribute to ongoing processes. So the idea in co-production is not that we start something anew, separate, but that actually we look at what are the ongoing processes that we are working in, that are already happening in the context, and how can we, as people from the project, contribute, make a meaningful contribution to these processes. How can we foster long-term thinking way beyond the process of the project time frame, but also how can we really recognize what happened before the project came into being? And how can we really work with what are the local people's or the stakeholders' vision, their expectations, their desires? How can we really support some of their processes? So, and maybe can I just ask Case or Funda or anyone, if I can't see the chat, so if there are any questions or if there are any hands up, please feel free to interrupt me. So co-production really looks at how can we really make sense of a longer term vision together. And this cartoon was drawn up a couple of years ago, 2 years ago, when we looked at about long-term development and how we can really, in these co-production processes, hopefully capture the more visionary, positive, and really forward-looking, inspirational sort of new ideas that are generated from the co-production process. So the future doesn't look bleak and induces despair, but more creative and inspiring. And I think you can read the caption. No thanks, we're going to create some alternative options over here, want to join. I think that is at the heart of a co-production process. So what is co-production? The co-production term has been interpreted in many different ways, but in this context, I really want to describe it as a process of sharing and learning and producing new knowledge while engaging with diverse groups of stakeholders and knowledge holders. Maybe this is an interesting distinction that we can make. Instead of stakeholders, I think we can start speaking of knowledge holders, because that really pays tribute to that all of us bring very specific pieces of knowledge to the table. May it be technically, may it be scientifically, or may it be socially. When we talk about co-production, I'd like to frame it in a way that includes partners from different academic disciplines and representatives of different types of organizations and sectors. So it's academia, it's social organizations, it's civil societies, it is businesses, it's state organizations, government, paragovernmental organizations, etc. And the learning process, quite importantly, really values all perspectives and is not placing one perspective higher than others. So science is as valid as the understanding of what business need or what state organizations' perspectives are. And I think the real magic in co-production processes comes in when we can say, so we have these different knowledge holders, they come together, and it's not about deciding who is right. It is a process that very profoundly looks at how can we come together to look at it from different perspectives? How can we walk in the shoes of someone who is trying to manage a complex system on the operational side? How can we walk in the shoes of someone who's a scientist or someone who belongs to a community-based organization, to really appreciate their perspectives and therefore learn about the complexity of the system? I'd like to share with you a couple of insights from a long process of the city learning labs that we ran in Southern Africa. You can see a huge number of partners, maybe you can see, that came together in these learning labs. And I want to say these learning processes were not a linear from A to B journey. It was a journey that evolved, and it involved especially looking at the complex system from afar and having a predefined maybe response, like some people think a shark, it's scary or it's fascinating. This is a great white shark in the in Cape Town in the aquarium. But the co-production process really says, can we zoom in and can we zoom out and can we zoom in onto another aspect and can we zoom out again? Can we look at the teeth? Can we see what is happening here? Why are the teeth like this? Why is it scary for some? What does it mean for the bigger picture? And so the direction of traveling co-production processes is often really co-determined by your fellow participants. Of course, within the framing and confines of the PARATUS project, but it is really important that all participants feel this is our process, we're moving forward with this, and we have a very clear idea what our direction of travel is because we were part of setting it up. So a co-production process is not a linear process. This is the learning co-production and learning process in Fractal. And you can see here, there was an initial workshop, there were some training sessions, collaborations, interviews, more learning lab workshops, more exploration, field trips, dialogues, and all of this ended up in a couple of really hands-on outputs in informing policy on city level on water, which was the issue that was identified in the first learning lab as the most crucial aspect to be addressed in Lusaka. We're working with people that bring their stories, their enthusiasm, their worries, their concerns, and I think it is really important that co-production processes really acknowledge everyone who's there for what they can bring. And also to acknowledge that everyone here will have different questions that are all valid to the process. So co-production process really tries to facilitate bringing all of this to the table respectfully and really having a very open and candid conversation that is importantly safe for all participants to engage in. So we had a number of learning lab feedback sessions, and I think I wanted to just flag a couple. And the one is that we had exchange visits. Now, exchange visits with the PARATUS study sites is going to be a bit harder, but maybe exchange visits within the study sites might be easier achievable. To really exchange experiences and to have positive learning experiences. And I think quite importantly, what I also wanted to flag is that policy briefs often really led to quite synergy sort of heavy policy briefs that could really be meaningful to policymakers. And we drew on the mass mapping that I'm going to show a picture of just now. The learning process also included field trips. When we talked about water in Lusaka, people had lots of questions around where is the borehole water coming? This is the borehole number 5 in Lusaka. And there was a description, there was a field trip to say, can we have a look at what is happening at this site so we can really understand what is going on, what are the different perspectives, how does the knowledge holder, who is the caretaker, who you see here in the back, the caretaker of the borehole, what is his perspective on the water situation? Why are there 2 armed guards at the entrance of the borehole? What does it mean for the security situation? I think field trips are very powerful to understand better the complexity, and they were also really powerful in forging conversations and trust and collegiality between the knowledge holders. Understanding how water comes to people, what the situation is, what the challenges are, to really hear from locals what their perspectives are has been a really important part in the co-production process. And looking at how the water, for example, is filtered, so you really have a very diverse range of perspectives on the particular topic that you feel, together with your fellow travelers on this learning journey, is something that you want to focus on. And if you realize that people are taking selfies while on a field trip, I think it's a good indicator that really that sort of bond and that common purpose and identity has been achieved. So here you can see the mass mapping and how the complexity of the system works. This was a result of a group mapping exercise, and you can see here it's quite complicated. How does the water quality of Lusaka is affected? Who are the role players, and what are the processes that are important? It reminded me a little bit of our impact chains, and I'm sure we can see how we can effectively complement these methodologies. We also looked at how can we even understand who are the stakeholders in these processes and who is involved, and where do we maybe have some barriers of communication, like we can see here. Where do we have stakeholders that are quite removed, but they should be closer? Who is working here close together, and maybe there is already some good communication? The result is not the important part of this. What is more important is the conversation of the stakeholders to be candid and open and say, yes, we are not very involved in this process, but we would like to be involved more. And so the co-production process in Lusaka, and I quickly wanted to just share this with you, resulted in some climate risk narratives that we shared as part of the policy briefs to look at 3 scenarios that are quite likely in terms of the climate science and the modeling. They all include higher temperatures, but obviously the precipitation forecast varies quite a bit. And we looked at what are the impacts on natural systems, on urban systems specifically, what are societal consequences, and what are possible responses. And interestingly enough, often, in this case at least, the responses were similar. And so for the policymakers, it was a really important part when they said, oh, so you mean if we do this, we'll be okay, never mind which scenario will come our way. And so I want to say there are two really important key areas for us to keep in mind when we talk about co-production. The one is that we have to become much better listeners. It's really important to listen to what is being said, but also important to what is not being said, what has been maybe said between the lines. Who's not coming to the meeting, although they should be? Can we have a bilateral conversation? Can we really feel our way into these processes? And really, how can we have a flexible mind while working with dynamic problems is very key. So what is important here? I think it's important to make sure that we design the process in a way that we can make magic happen, that it's not a boring process, that it's a bit enticing in a way that people feel comfortable to taking a small risk. It's really important to let the delegates or the participants drive their own learning process within the parameters of PARATUS, of course, that we need to be transparent about. And it is really important to ensure a good flow from one learning lab to the next, so that we really feel participants are on a journey with us as we move through the events and the processes. We put together a guide for effective collaboration on learning consortia. I can share that with you, and some of the principles are really also valid for PARATUS and the co-production. I'm going to share them with you briefly. The first, I already mentioned, the importance of building on existing efforts. It's really key. Let's acknowledge that things have happened before, and let's explore how we can contribute to them. It's more work, it takes more time in the beginning. It sometimes may be harder, but it really is very crucial for participants to feel this is a continuation of their process and not a new beginning to something that they feel is already happening. The next one is to be very clear from the onset on what is our desired impact. Why are we doing PARATUS? What do we want to achieve? And why is it important for us to really work with knowledge holders or stakeholders? The third principle is to provide sufficient time for concept development. So can we make sure we really understand what the situation is, what the problems are, the challenges are, before we move into the sort of solution space and to explore what can be done about it. It's really important that we speak early about a joint vision, the expectations, there's clear responsibilities, so we can really have a cross-cultural and transdisciplinary engagement. We really feel like we're all on the same page. And of course, it is really key to build trust and have strong relationships as we go through this. So where do we need to go from here? I think it is important to see that we need to really think about what are our tools and processes that we'd like to use, looking at innovative and inclusive dialogue to really co-create knowledge and to jointly implement this. Just hang on one second. Sorry, I'm just giving a webinar at the moment. Are you here for the PARATUS meeting?
Yes.
Ah, fantastic. Please take a seat and you can half listen. Welcome. Okay, so for those of you who are joining, we are already joined here by some colleagues, so that's really nice. And I think what is really important is also to say, how can we make sure that we really turn these co-production processes in not like the image on the left to say we feel isolated and frustrated, but how can we really make sure we take the energy and the inspiration of what we would like to achieve, the way forward, into the co-production processes. That is the end of the presentation.